Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. It's my pleasure to be here. And now we're going to continue our reading and discussion of this book, Rome and Civil Liberties by James A. Wiley. And we're learning how the papacy sets up his government in every nation. He inserts into the country bishops, and they divide up the land into dioceses, and then they begin to meet in synods. The bishops all gather together in synods, congresses, if you will, and they pass legislation, which is then carried off to Rome, which is reviewed by the Pope, and then once ratified by the Pope, it is sent back to the bishops, and it becomes law. It becomes part of the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, and to every Roman Catholic, that is divine law. It has been dispensed by the Pope, which is the divinity of the Roman Catholic Church, and it is to be believed and adhered to and bound to the conscience, and it becomes a sin against God to violate these laws. And now you see that the Pope is inserting into Great Britain, Protestant Great Britain, which has its own government, a Protestant government. The papacy has inserted into Great Britain another jurisdiction, a papal jurisdiction, a divine jurisdiction according to Roman Catholic canon law, and one that has absolutely no regard for the established government of Great Britain. It's a hostile overthrow of the country. Now, if the United States of America today has bishops, Roman Catholic bishops, and they meet in synods, and they adopt legislation, as most congresses do, that's the very purpose for their gathering, to pass legislation, and if that legislation then goes to the papacy for ratification and receives the signature of the papacy, then it becomes divine law. It becomes part of the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church. It is regarded as infallible and binding upon the conscience. And then once that legislation then is received by the bishops, it is imposed by those bishops upon the people in their dioceses, whether they be Roman Catholic or not. Now, it's obvious to anybody that comprehends what I've just said that this is a shadow government or a parallel government, a hostile parallel government. In every country of the world where there are dioceses and bishops and synodical synods, there is an alternative government in that land. Not just in the United States of America and not just in Britain. It's all over the world. It's the reestablishment of the old world order. This is how the bishops functioned. This is how the Pope functioned in the old world order. That's how they controlled the governments of the world. And it's being re-erected in the world, even as we speak, and nowhere more so than the United States of America. That's why this book is so important for our understanding of what's really going on in Washington, D.C. and the world today. One doesn't have any hope at all of comprehending what is happening in the world today, including the United States of America, unless he understands what this book is talking about. And our confirmation was given in the previous book that we read, The Global Vatican, by former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. These two works together give us a complete picture of what's going on. If you want to know what the New World Order is, stay tuned to Inquisition Update. We'll continue to explain it so that everyone can understand it. Now, we concluded on the very top of the page 67 yesterday in the broadcast, and today we're going to back up and reread the previous paragraph and then continue on. But there's some explanation that needs to be done on page 66 of this book, beginning in the first full paragraph, about a third of the way down the page. Now we're talking about these 12 bishops that reign under Cardinal Wiseman in the official reestablishment of the Roman Catholic hierarchy and Roman Catholic Church government in England. He says the 12 territorial bishops, they're territorial because they are bishops over a specific area called a diocese. He says the 12 territorial bishops form an organic machinery. Okay? It's an apparatus. It has a function, and it's organic, meaning it's living and breathing. It's alive. It's not an inanimate machine. It's an animate machine. It's a human machine with blood coursing through its veins. Okay? It's a living, breathing organism. And it has a purpose, as most machines do. What is that machinery's purpose? To crank out laws. To crank out what is hoped to become divine laws that binds the consciences of everyone within those 12 territorial bishoprics or dioceses. He says the 12 territorial bishops form an organic machinery which renders the now centralized authority of the Roman Church. What is the centralized authority of the Roman Church? Why, it's divinity, the Pope, God on earth, according to Roman Catholic canon law. Okay, these bishops render now to the centralized authority of the Roman Church, now practically available for the governments of the Romanists in our country. Okay, practically available. What does he mean by practically available? It has now the ability to function. That's what makes it practical. It can now practice. Once it's established, once it's recognized and authorized by the papacy, once it has become an organic machinery, living and breathing, it now becomes a practical or useful government for Romanists, that is, papists, in the country. This is how the monster gets its life. It becomes a living, breathing soul when the God of Rome breathes breath into its nostrils. Okay? It's like the account of the creation story. This is how Satan's government gets its breath. And he says the great object of the propaganda in the erection of territorial dioceses, what is the object of the creation of these dioceses? And it says, and the appointment of a bishop over each with jurisdiction was synodical action, quote unquote, synodical action. Okay, this was the action or that practical availability of government for Romanists in the country. That's how the synodical action worked. Synodical action was the setting up of this living, breathing organism, this machinery, to govern every man, woman, and child in these dioceses. That's the first synodical action, the creation of the government of the Pope, a living, breathing government, a practical government, a useful government, one that achieves an end, one that achieves real functionality. Not imagined, not spiritual, but real. Okay? He says this was much insisted upon at the time. It was pleaded in defense of the papal aggression because without bishops with territorial status and titles, synods could not, according to the rules of the Church of Rome, be convened. And without provincial synods, the government of the church could not be carried on. Okay? This is where I liken the synodical action, or the congresses of the Roman Catholic Church, if you want to call it that. I choose to retain the terminology used here in the book. Synodical action is the same as, well, the Senate of the U.S. Congress, or the House of Representatives of the U.S. Congress. First, they must have officers, congressmen, and they must have titles to be recognized. They must have jurisdiction, and they must be able to meet on a regular basis to legislate law. That's exactly what is required of these 12 bishops of of Great Britain. It says the grand object of the propaganda in the erection of territorial dioceses and the appointment of a bishop over each with jurisdiction was, quote unquote, synodical action. All right? That was the whole purpose for installing these bishops, dividing up the land, giving these bishops official titles, official territories, and official jurisdiction, that is legal control. The whole purpose was so that they could perform their congressional duties called synodical action. So when you hear the term used in this book, synodical action, just think of convening Congress. Now we can all turn on our televisions and see the day that all of the civil bishops, that is your representatives and your congressmen, your senators, all meet in session. You can watch it every day on CNN, or what's the other television program that focuses all of its attention on the legislation. I'll think of it in a moment. You probably already know the name of it. But they meet and they legislate. And once they legislate, their bills go from house to house and then off to the president for signature. Well, it works the same way in these synodical actions. The bishops, the Congress, gets together. They legislate laws to govern their people. It passes from the bishops to the archbishop or the cardinal, and then it's forwarded to Rome for signature. It's kind of spooky, isn't it? It's almost like the beast and the shadow of the beast, right? The image of the beast, it operates the same way. Now you know where we get the model for our civil government of this country. It's just identical to the way Rome has always governed her church. So the bishops are the Congress, and their synodical action is the very purpose they get together, to pass laws. And what we're going to find out in this book is these laws they pass don't have just spiritual import, as they do in the Protestant churches. No, they have temporal import. They control both the spirit and the body. And that's going to become readily apparent as we continue. He says this dividing up the land to form bishoprics, and so that they could perform their synodical duties, the legislation of Roman Catholic canon law, this was very much insisted upon at the time. It was pleaded in defense of the papal aggression, because without bishops with territorial status and titles, synods could not, according to the Church of Rome, be convened, and without provincial synods, the government of the church could not be carried on. Okay? The government of the Roman Catholic Church could not be carried on without these bishops, without this synodical action, any more than the civil government of Washington, D.C. can be conducted without the convention or the convening of all of the civil bishops, if you want to look at it that way, in Congress. If they don't have titles, they don't have jurisdiction, they don't have territories, they can't meet. And if they can't meet, they can't legislate. And if they can't legislate, they can't beseech the Pope to grant divinity to their legislation. They cannot govern the church. I mean, everything we're talking about here gives us absolutely no reason to doubt what these bishoprics are all about. It's about legislation. It's about government. And it's not about the Bible at all. It's not about God at all. Unless, of course, you consider the Pope to be God or the vicar of God. And since he's not, what could the purpose of all this be? Control. Government. And not just in name only. It's a living, breathing organism. It's practical. It has effect and purpose. And that's for the government of not just Roman Catholics, but everyone within these dioceses. And if the world be scattered and peeled with dioceses, the whole world is governed by the Pope. If you think this is a stretch of the imagination, keep listening to James A. Wiley and confirm what he says in history. Now he says, the real drift, in other words, the real purpose of the synodical action, the real purpose of the Roman Catholic Congress, if you will, and especially its bearing on the independence of the nation, was not then very clearly perceived. In other words, the people didn't know what synodical action meant. They didn't even know what a bishopric meant. They didn't even know what the cardinal's purpose was. They didn't even understand papal infallibility, or that the Pope considered himself some kind of a representative of God, perhaps. So all of this was done without the people generally comprehending what was really going on. That's how Rome got by with it. He says the real drift of the synodical action, and especially its bearing on the independence of the nation, was not then clearly perceived. But events have since helped to make it exceedingly plain. Provincial synods are holden, that is, they are held, provincial synods, that is, the synodical action or the Congress of the Roman Catholic Church, are held. They pass decrees touching the government of the church, that is, they pass legislation that governs the church, and these decrees are sent to Rome. At Rome, they receive the sanction of the Pope, that is, the Pope's signature. And when so ratified, I mean, isn't ratification what you expect of a law? That's exactly what it is. It's law. It's a whole system of legislation, of law. And it says, and when so ratified, they are returned to Great Britain, having all the authority of papal bulls. All right? Papal bulls are the most authoritative writings that the papacy can make. When a pope writes a papal bull, it has the effect and force of divinity, infallibility. And one may not even mentally disagree. It binds the conscience. It binds the body. And it affects every aspect of the human life. And to oppose a papal bull, which has the effect of canon law, it becomes a part of the canon law. is to reject the God in Rome. It's treason. And it's subject to excommunication and eternal damnation for doing so. So it's a real system of law, and it has punishments that include eternal damnation. And that's how they bind the conscience. This is how the system of legislation of the Roman Catholic Church and of the world, including the civil governments that you think are not bound by these papal bulls, that's how they are governed. That's how it is the supreme government of all the world. All right? Whether people believe it or not, it's a system in place. It's been in place almost since the very founding of the Roman Catholic Church. Now he says the monthly importation of bulls from Rome, had they occurred, and their public proclamation in the country would have awakened alarm, would have raised troublesome questions, and might have led eventually to the revival of some of the old securities against the traffickings of foreign priests. What's he talking about? Well, if it weren't for these the synodical actions, the gathering privately of the bishops to legislate, and they're secretly whisking off their legislation to the Pope for signature, why, the Pope would have been left to just govern directly by papal bulls to be announced to the whole country by the cardinal. And if Great Britain's peace would have been disrupted about once every month with another papal bull, well, the Britons might have started asking a question. Well, the Pope has nothing to do with this country. We're loyal subjects of the Queen. Why is the Pope pronouncing his papal bulls every month in this country? He has no jurisdiction here. He has no right to say anything in this country unless we invite him to speak. He's a potentate of a foreign country that lives thousands of miles from here. Why should we give the Pope the right to come and dictate to us and speak to the citizens of this country when we're all loyal to the Queen? He professes to be a king and a king of kings. Why do we allow him a voice in this country? We're independent. We form our own laws in our own Congress. And it binds the people of all the people in this country. And it maintains their liberties. Why do we allow this tyrant to come every month and to spew his tyranny all over this country when we declared our independence from the Pope back in the days of Henry VIII? You see, England would have wakened up if the Pope issued his bulls every month. So Rome found an underground way of doing exactly the same thing. A way in which the people wouldn't instantly recognize. Okay? He says the monthly importation of bulls from Rome and their public proclamation in the country would have awakened alarm. And what alarm would that have been? Protestant alarm. Why are we allowing the Antichrist of the Bible to issue monthly bulls establishing law in this country? Okay? Well, they didn't want to wake up the Protestants. And he said it would have raised troublesome questions like, what authority does the Pope have to speak in this country? We kicked the Pope out of Britain back in the days of Henry VIII. And it might have led eventually to the revival of some of the old securities against the traffickings, the legislation of this foreign priest. What were those old securities? Protestantism. We'll be back right after the message. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support the program, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors it. And if you'd like to contact me, please do so. I encourage you. My email address is tom@seawaves.us. tom@seawaves.us. Now, what James A. Wiley is clearly telling us, that these synodical synods are gathered to promulgate law and to get the approval of the Pope, and then to give it the force of law, the force of divine law, to be imposed upon all Roman Catholics. Now, if it weren't for these synods, if it weren't for these jurisdictions of the bishops, If it weren't for this formal structure of legislation imposed through the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope would have had to issue bulls every month. He would have had to come out publicly with a bull every month to govern the church. Well, look, Great Britain would say, listen, these Roman Catholics over which these rules govern, they're British citizens. They have a government already. It's vested in the breast of the Queen or Parliament. We have a system of law. We pass our own laws. The people are represented in this system. They have a way to redress grievances even in this system of law. Why do we want to allow a dictator from Rome even to come here and dictate law? To allow that to happen would be an act of treason against the Queen, wouldn't it? Well, of course. I mean, you wouldn't want Putin to start issuing every month through the press of the United States laws that govern Russians in this country, would you? They're Americans. They're already bound by the civil laws of this country. Why do we want another dictator, another potentate, to legislate laws parallel to our own government, and not simply parallel, but in conflict with our government? That's what the papal bulls would have done, and the papal bulls is what would have been required if it were not for this system of legislation, these synodical actions to take place. All right, listen to what he says. He says the monthly importation of bulls from Rome and their public proclamation in the country would have awakened alarm, would have raised troublesome questions, and might have even led eventually to the revival, something that existed before, the revival of some of the old securities against the traffickings, that is, the laws of foreign priests. But these difficulties were dexterously avoided. You know what dexterity is? Dexterity is demonstrated by a running back that is very swift of foot and agile and can dodge his opponents and carry the ball to the end zone no matter how many people are pursuing him, right? They were dexterously avoided by the contrivance of synodical synods, whose edicts ratified by the Pope are in fact papal bulls, and as such receive implicit submission from the conscience of every papist. There is thus established a great factory of Roman Catholic canon law on the soil of Great Britain. All right? Britain would never have tolerated the Pope issuing monthly legislation. But if British citizens who call themselves bishops, who adopt territories, who appoint themselves governors, who meet in legislation and synodical synods, pass laws, carry them off to the Pope, and then the Pope sends them back with his signature, well, that's how the Pope can govern the church without raising Protestant protest. And that's exactly what they do in this country. That's why there's no protest, because the Protestants in this country don't understand that when the bishops get together, it's a Congress. It's a legislative session that once they have written their laws that govern the quote-unquote church, they're hustled off to Rome. Rome gives it their signature. It comes back in the form of a papal decree, divine unction. It binds the consciences of everyone that lives in those dioceses. And eventually, those laws are then rewritten in the Jesuit universities, the law schools of the Jesuit universities in this country, put in terms that don't expose their Roman Catholic or papal origin, and then they're shuffled off to the literal Congress in Washington, D.C., and they're repassed in the form of civil law. So first we have the bishops get together to legislate laws that govern the Roman Catholic Church. Once they are written, they're sent off to Rome for signature. Rome signs them. They come back. They become canon law. Then that canon law is sent off to the Jesuit universities, the law schools. The language is read. It's retranslated into a language that's not offensive to people like you and me. It's sent off to Congress, where Senator Grassley gets to sign off on them, which, by the way, is Roman Catholic, and so are most of his senators, fellow senators. And once they have passed it through the House and the Senate, it goes off to the president's signature, and then it becomes the civil law. That's how Rome has conquered us. That's how Rome makes us all Catholic without our knowledge. The same ignorance that kept Great Britain from standing up and putting a halt to the erection of a legislative body headed up by the Pope in Great Britain back at the time of the writing of this book has been a fact on the ground in this country almost since the beginning of this country. The civil law is Roman Catholic canon law under another cover in a language that doesn't raise Protestant sentiment, that doesn't raise Protestant suspicion. I'll bet this is starting to make a lot of sense to a lot of people now, isn't it? That's how the system works. That's how the old world order worked. And that's how the new world order works too. Now, the United States, what little Protestantism is left in the country, might be awakened if the Pope got on TV every month and started directly legislating with divine law, binding the consciences of every American, Catholic and Protestant. I mean, eventually somebody might wake up in the country to see the Pope every month on CNN proclaiming legislation in the form of divine law. Thou shalt not, thus and so. Somebody might wake up and say, what is this guy in Rome doing legislating and making laws? I'm not Roman Catholic. As a matter of fact, my neighbor who is Roman Catholic probably doesn't appreciate the Pope binding his conscience to laws that he doesn't approve of and would rather take his grievances to our civil government and not to the Pope. After all, that Roman Catholic, he's a good poker player. We play golf every Sunday. We get along just fine. He's an American citizen. He fights in American wars. He pays his taxes just like I do. Well, he has rights just like I do. And maybe he doesn't like the Pope telling him what to do all the time and what not to do. Maybe he would rather call himself an American than a Roman Catholic. And we just don't like the Pope dictating in this country. You see, Protestantism is the protest against this dictator. And we don't call him just a dictator. We call him a diabolical tyrant. We call him the Antichrist of the Bible. We call him the man of sin, the son of perdition, the vice Christ, the one who deceives the whole world. And we don't want him to have a voice of any kind in this country. So the Pope is not allowed, or just dexterously avoids making his monthly promulgations over the television. He just causes his bishops to all get together in synod. That's not talked about in the press. And it's never described what the purpose of their gathering is. But James A. Wiley tells us it's legislation of civil and moral law. And once it goes back to the Pope for signature, it becomes divine, infallible, binding upon the conscience, and any dissent in any fashion, whether it be physical dissent, outright rebellion, or whether it be conscientious rebellion, it's subject to excommunication and eternal damnation. It's sin, damnable sin, to violate that law. Now, once it has been adopted by the bishops and it's passed, it's become official Roman Catholic canon law, then the only object left for the Vatican is to make it also the civil law, so that no one can claim exemption from obedience to the law. And in walks the Jesuits. We'll take that legislation, thank you very much, and they pick up the Roman Catholic canon law, they take it to the Jesuit University, they gather up all the Jesuit lawyers, they dissect the law, making sure never to depart from its true intent. They just change it from Latin into English and put it in a way that won't provoke Protestant sentiment. And then they get sponsors in the House of Representatives and sponsors in the Senate, and they all haggle over the law, and it gets passed with amendments or whatever. But more than anything, it has its language changed so it doesn't offend the Protestant sentiment. And it becomes the law of the land. The president signs it. And now you and I, you Protestants, along with me, are equally bound with Roman Catholics. And of course, if we dissent from the law, we in our minds say we're in dissent against this civil law. We have a system of handling our grievances. We'll go to the government. But if the government wants to find you guilty of violation of the civil law, they put you in the penitentiary so you can do penance. See, you're already under Roman Catholic canon law. You must do penance in the penitentiary for violating the civil law, which is just Roman Catholic canon law under another cover. See, the Pope has layer after layer after layer of cover. And that's why no one suspects him today. And since they don't recognize the papacy as the man of sin, the son of perdition, the one who deceives the whole world, the one who styles himself the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the one who lorded it over the whole earth during the old world order, never do they suspect that he has anything to do with the new world order. He's just a drooling old man in Rome in a funky-looking hat and a dress and little red shoes, and he really doesn't have any purpose in the world anyway. He's just like the President of the United States, a figurehead. Has no power. And besides that, the Roman Catholic priest pedophile pandemic has ruined the reputation of the church. They have no credibility anywhere. And Tom Friess nor anybody else is going to convince me that the Pope has any authority anywhere in this world. And he's certainly not going to convince me that the Roman Catholic Church is incalculably rich, because the Roman Catholic priests are always beating their tin cups and wanting donations. And besides that, all of the lawsuits against the pedophile priests had drained the Roman Catholic Church of any wealth it had. Tom Friess is a nut. And you shouldn't ought to listen to him. And how convenient. Because people don't want to listen anyway. Now they've got an excuse. But just explain what's happening into this country, anything close to as vivid and as commonsensibly correct as I've just described them. I defy anybody to look at what's happening in Washington, D.C., what's happening in your local state legislation, what's happening in your local county legislation, what's happening in your local municipal legislation, and completely exonerate the papacy of any influence and then try to make sense of it. Can't do it. That's why this country is so confused. That's why this country lashes out at this group and that group, the bankers, the lawyers, the this, the that, the Democrats, the Republicans. And the Vatican has given you all kinds, innumerable targets to aim your anathemas at, but never the Pope. How convenient for the papacy. And besides that, you don't dare want to mention the Pope because you might start a religious war in this country. A religious war that started in heaven before the world was. And a war that will not end until the real King of Kings and Lord of Lords comes and finishes this war. And why will it have to be Christ to finish this war? Because God's people don't even know who the enemy is. And nor do they care to listen. But James A. Wiley is faced with the same excuses in Great Britain at the time of the writing of this book as I have right now on Inquisition Update. You can about imagine that James A. Wiley was considered a kook. Oh, he must have been molested by a Roman Catholic priest. He just got a grudge against the Roman Catholic Church for whatever reason. We'll just dismiss him as a radical bigot. But James A. Wiley could say to the Britons at the same time that I'm saying to the Americans, then you explain what's happening in Britain today in any better fashion, in any more understandable way than I've just described what's happening in Britain in 1865. And of course, there would have been no better takers to that offer than there is to Tom Friess in 2015 in the United States of America. Nobody can explain it. James A. Wiley explained it, and I'm just parroting his words. He made sense then, he makes sense today. And I want Americans to understand this. What James A. Wiley has done is protected the Great Britons from guilt, because what they have literally done is allowed Antichrist to freely come into their country and dictate laws and to nullify God's holy, immutable, and eternal law in Great Britain and make them slaves to a Roman tyrant under another law, Roman Catholic canon law, which is the antithesis of God's holy, eternal, and immutable law. It teaches them to worship a man, a sinful, wicked man, the man of sin, and to repudiate the Son of God. James A. Wiley was very careful, at least so far in the writing of this book, not to offend Christians with the truth. But to the degree that the Britons at this time have committed high treason against the throne of Almighty God, against Jesus' rightful throne in Great Britain, to that same degree have we committed treason against our Christ by allowing the man of sin to legislate our laws and to make us all slaves and to deceive us. And we must repent. We must repent. We must repent in sackcloth and ashes. But Great Britain allowed the Romans to set up their manufactory of Roman Catholic canon law right on the soil of Great Britain. No less have we done so. The country is completely canvassed with bishoprics. Real jurisdictions, functional jurisdictions. Living, breathing bishops oversee. They get together on regular basis to adopt laws sent off to Rome for ratification, which become Roman Catholic canon law, given back to the bishops to enforce in their dioceses, and then adopted eventually as civil law in this land. Where is there room for Christ or his law? Now, James A. Wiley asked the question, should we grant that these resolutions passed in Synod and afterwards ratified at Rome are mainly about spiritual matters? It is nevertheless true that they are spiritual in such a way as to imply the control of the body and the disposal of the goods of the Romanists. All right? Isn't that what our civil laws do? They control our body and they regulate the disposal of our goods when we die. He says, in truth, these synods charge themselves with the regulation of all matters appertaining to their flocks as a social and political community. For instance, they can place certain classes of schools under ban. Certain classes of schools under ban. In other words, forbid Roman Catholics to go to certain schools. Guess what schools those were? Well, the public school system. The public school system, which in the beginning of this country allowed the Bible and allowed God's holy, immutable, and eternal law to be taught. That taught people how to read out of the Bible. Roman Catholics weren't allowed to go to those schools. And of course now, every child in this country is bound by law to attend those public schools. Why is that? Because now the Bible's not available in the schools. And the public schools have become, without naming themselves so, they've become papal schools. They become equal to parochial schools. They're no longer Protestant. Okay? The papacy, according to Roman Catholic canon law, is the supreme teacher of all the earth. That's Roman Catholic canon law. No education system formulated on this earth can exist very long until the Pope picks the curriculum. And every system of education, every secretary of education in this world is obliged to strip that curriculum of any Protestant understanding. No Bible, no God's law, nothing but liberal arts. Liberal arts is just another way to say every area of study except religious. Every area of study except biblical. Science, mathematics, social studies, you name it. Physiology, sociology, chemistry. You can learn basket weaving in the schools, but you cannot learn about the Creator. So, without becoming outright parochial schools, they achieved the same thing. Total ignorance about God. But before, when they were Protestant, Rome forbid Catholics to go to the local public school system. And Catholics were forced to erect their own schools that taught popery, that taught Roman Catholic canon law, and that held the papacy to be God on earth in the consciences of every Roman Catholic. And after that long a time without protest in this country, now they've ascended to the halls of government. And when the Jesuits issued their Roman Catholic canon law, those Catholics pass it and bind you to it. That's how you're made Catholic. I'll see you tomorrow.